Since the late 19th century, filmmakers created and audiences have experienced amazing worlds. Ever since, movies have captured our imaginations. This form of escapism was exclusively captured, projected, and stored by celluloid film for over 100 years. Until now, digital technology has emerged to challenge film's place and change the medium of cinema. Digital technology has advanced to the point where it has changed the mode of production of film and the nature in which we consume them. In this film, my fellow filmmakers and I will chronicle the fundamental historical events which have shaped the digital cinema now. However, spectatorship have changed due to digitization of film and the invention of small media devices, and finally, the history and revival of cinema in Auckland.
It's amazing to think back that digital really began with in the 1960s at Bell Labs, where the first CCD chips were invented, and in the 1970s Sony bought the first CCD chips and developed the first consumer hand quality camcorders in the 1980s. This ultimately led to being shot cinematically with a film called The Celebration by Thomas Winterberg, which was then started by the Dogma 95 movement in Copenhagen, Denmark. Then at the same time, Avid bought the first ever Android from Lucasfilm and developed the first ever compact and cost-efficient editing system that we all know today, which was used on such films as The English Patient. But digital really began to take a toll when two major films came out in 2002 with George Lucas's Star Wars Episode 2 and Robert Rodriguez's Once Upon a Time in Mexico, both of which were filmed on the F500 camera, which was the first ever cinematic camera to be used on a feature film. But one of the problems with digital cinema back then was the resolution. You had your normal standard definition camera, which was about 720 by 480, which was only about this big, whereas high definition cameras were about 1920 by 120, which is your regular high definition TVs that you have in your home. Now you have 2K or even 4K or even 5K, 6K, which they just invented now. Then afterwards, filmmakers began to follow Lucas's philosophy. So did the camera companies. They all began to make a serious push into the digital cinema. Michael Mann followed right afterwards with the film Collateral. Then camera companies such as Panavision created Panavision Genesis in 2005. Then in 2007, the red cameras came along, the red ones. Then in 2010 came the Arri Alexas by Arri. But digital cinema didn't really receive open arms from Hollywood until 2009. Slumdog Millionaire won the Academy Award for the cinematography. It was the first time ever the award was given to a film shot almost entirely on digital cameras with the silicon imaging SI2K cameras. While at the same time that year, James Cameron introduced the first digital 3D movie with Avatar, which then became the first film to be ever digitally projected, and thus ultimately introduced digital archival, which now became the new ways of showing films and storing films.
Do you remember the first movie you've ever watched at the cinema? My first celluloid motion picture experience was The Lion King in 1994. I remember my mum held my hands as she led me into a dark cave-like room. The vast apoptic arena resembled outer space with rows and rows of countless seats, all facing a towering barren screen. Strangers began filling the number of seats. We sat together in the over-enveloping darkness, and then... The smell of popcorn, the child kicking your seat from behind, the old lady that keeps shushing at every small noise. Good or bad, this is all part of the cinematic experience. Martin Scorsese describes cinema as the church of the 20th century. Everyone comes together despite different religious affiliation in a dark space to stare at a dark object and feel some communal sense. We all became members of the first church of cinematic science. Cinema first began in the 1900s in form of pure spectacle with limited narrative and plot. Films evolved to be used as a channel for wartime propaganda to create a sense of collective nationalism in support of wartime efforts for both the good guys and the bad. Cinema was a tool for manipulating emotional and cultural identification and connecting the mass populace to historical events and national identity. So how has the digital revolution changed or impacted this important cultural site and activity? Since the 50s, we've seen a major shift in moving images from the big screen cinema to the domestic arena. The advent of television is said to be like Protestantism. It broke up the mass audience into more and more sects as there are various channels. And with further technological advancements in the 80s, from the VCR, cable TV, and now to the digital image recorders, players, and computers, this has changed the nature of spectatorship within a generation. With smaller digital devices like laptops, smartphones, to small individual screens on airplane seats, cinema and spectatorship has diverged and gained access into our daily lives as we walk around, work, travel, and play. As watching films on the small screen become the norm, there's definitely a loss of the spiritual and tangible communal space in which we collectively foster our desire and fantasies, search for identification, and vent our frustrations in reception to the imagery on the screen. The collective experience of the multiplex has given way to a rise in virtual communities. Access to not only media but the other users creates a global spectatorship where media and community are available on demand. Transference of film produced for large screen reception to small screen players fail to take into consideration the nature of audience reception and the viewing experience under different conditions. Although media-savvy consumers are able to understand the narrative plot, they are unable to enjoy the specific experience of viewing as much as when in a big screen cinema setting. Shifting audience attention and changing environmental factors which disrupt the viewing experience limit the enjoyment and hinders the interpretation of the film. Studies have shown that audience viewing film on small screen media players prefer lighter color palettes, tighter shot sizes, and narrative that requires less rapid cutting. For small screen devices to prosper as a distribution medium, films need to be accommodating to the features and limitations of the device. Only time will tell if the large screen cinematic experience will become an ancient ritual, and future films will be specifically designed to cater for small screen receptions only.
Film in New Zealand truly began in Auckland. The first public screening of a film was in 1896 at the Fuller's Opera House on Wellesley Street, now where Smith & Coe's stands today. By the late 1920s, a number of cinemas had been constructed in Auckland, including the Mercury Theatre, the St James, and the Crystal Palace Theatre in Mount Eden. Going to see a film became an incredibly exciting event. Moviegoers would dress in their finest clothes and expect to have an exhilarating night out and a visual feast. Often there would be dances held in the theatre ballrooms after the film was shown. With the arrival of Movietone News in 1929, going to the cinema became a brand new way for Aucklanders to see what was happening in the world. Now you could be informed and entertained all in one sitting. During the second half of the 20th century, cinemas started to notice a sudden decline in attendance. With the overwhelming boom of television in the 1950s, and the arrival of VHS in the late 70s, people began to go out to cinemas less frequently. However, in the 1980s, with the advent of the blockbuster, and new films boasting revolutionary special effects, cinema began to slowly regain popularity, and new multi-screen theatre complexes began to appear all over Auckland. With the arrival of new technology like IMAX in the 90s, cinema had fully re-emerged as an entertainment spectacle. Over the last few decades, older theatres in Auckland began to close. One by one, the doors shut and the buildings began to decay, leaving behind historical reminders of Auckland's golden age of cinema.
We have chronicled the history and revival of cinema in Auckland. We have explored the advancement of digital technology and its impact on our everyday lives, and we have learned the history of the birth